They say that if you spend long enough in darkness, you forget what sunlight feels like. But I never forgot. Even when my hands were raw from scrubbing stone, even when the metallic scent of blood clung to my hair no matter how many times I washed it, I remembered. I had to. Because remembering the sun was the only thing that kept me alive in that castle of endless night. My name is Sarah, and for 3 years, I was invisible. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though the beginning feels like a lifetime ago now. I was 17 when they came to my village, the collectors, as we called them. They wore dark cloaks that seemed to drink in the moonlight, and their faces were always hidden. They came once a year, always on the winter solstice, when the night stretched longest and the cold bit deepest into our bones. The bargain was simple, they told us. One person from each household offered to serve in the great castle on the mountain. In exchange, the village would be protected. From what, they never said explicitly, but we all knew. We'd all heard the stories of villages that refused, places that woke one morning to find every living soul drained dry, left as husked shells in their beds. My father had already been taken the year before. My mother was too ill to survive the journey. That left only me and my younger brother, Thomas, who was barely 12. When the collectors, cold eyes, fell on our doorway, I stepped forward before anyone could speak. I told them I would go. I told them to leave Thomas alone. I remember my brother screaming my name as they led me away. I remember turning back once, just once, to see him being held back by our neighbors, his face twisted in anguish. I promised myself I wouldn't cry, not then, not where they could see. So I saved my tears for later, for the rattling carriage ride up the mountain, where the wheels creaked against frozen earth and my breath came out in clouds of white. The castle loomed like a predator against the sky, all sharp towers and dark stone, windows that gleamed like eyes in the darkness. When we passed through the gates, I felt something shift in the air, something ancient and hungry pressing against my skin. There were 12 of us in that carriage, all young, all terrified. By the time we reached the servants' entrance, 3 had already fainted. They separated us immediately. Some were taken to the kitchens, others to the gardens that only bloomed at night. I was assigned to the cleaning staff, specifically, to the aftermath of what they called the gatherings. I learned very quickly what that meant. Every evening, just after sunset, the lords and ladies of the castle would host their banquets in the grand hall. They never ate food, of course. They consumed something far more precious. And when they were done, when the silk-draped tables were stained crimson and the marble floors were slick with what had been spilled, they would leave, and we would come in. My first night, I vomited 3 times. The senior maid, a woman named Margot who'd been there for 15 years, didn't judge me. She simply handed me a rag soaked in lavender water and told me to breathe through my mouth. She explained that if I wanted to survive, I had to learn to see the blood as just another stain, the bodies as just another mess to clean. She taught me to scrub in circular motions, to use salt water first, then vinegar, then finally the special solution they kept in the cellars, something that smelled of herbs and made the stone shine like new. I learned to move like a ghost through those halls, to keep my eyes down, my footsteps silent, my presence as small as possible. Because the one rule that governed everything, the rule that Margot whispered to me with genuine fear in her eyes, was this: never let them notice you. The vampires of Castle Noctis, that's what the older servants called it, though I never heard the masters use that name, were ancient things. Some had walked the earth for centuries. They saw humans as cattle, as tools, as temporary conveniences. To be noticed was to be interesting, and to be interesting was dangerous. So I made myself nothing. For 3 years, I was a shadow. I cleaned their messes. I scrubbed their floors. I laundered their silk sheets stained with God knows what. I watched servants around me disappear. Some ran away into the mountains and were never seen again. Others simply didn't wake up one morning. But I survived by being forgettable, by being the girl who did her work and asked no questions. Until the night Lucian Ashbourne noticed me. It was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because Tuesdays were always the worst. The gatherings on Tuesday nights were particularly excessive, as if the lords and ladies were celebrating making it through another week of immortal existence. I was on my hands and knees in the eastern corridor, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn stain on the marble, when I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck that meant someone was watching. I froze, my brush hovering over the stone. My first instinct was to run, but I knew that would be worse. Margot had taught me that too. If they see you, you stay still. You make yourself boring. You give them no reason to pursue. I heard footsteps then, slow and deliberate, each one echoing through the empty corridor. They were coming closer. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it, and I knew it was a he, somehow. The energy in the air felt masculine, ancient, patient. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I remember the exact moment I looked up. The candles in their sconces along the wall flickered, making shadows dance across the stone, and there he was. Lucien Ashbourne was a legend even among the vampires. The other servants spoke of him in hushed whispers, always with a mixture of awe and terror. He was the oldest of them all, the one who'd founded the castle centuries ago, the one who could walk through walls if he wished, who could hear a heartbeat from 3 floors away, who could make grown men weep with just a look. He was tall, impossibly so, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes that seemed to shift between silver and black depending on how the light hit them. He wore all black, as they all did, but on him it looked like shadows given form. His face was beautiful in that terrible, inhuman way that vampires have, too perfect, too symmetrical, missing some essential spark of warmth that makes faces human. He looked down at me with those mercurial eyes, and I felt like every secret I'd ever kept was being pulled from my mind. He spoke then, his voice like velvet wrapped around steel, and he told me I was different. Not in the way I cleaned, he said, but in something deeper. He told me my blood sang to him differently than other humans, that it pulsed with something that reminded him of a summer day he'd experienced 700 years ago. I didn't know what to say to that. What do you say when a creature of nightmare tells you your blood interests him? So I said nothing. I just stared up at him, my brush still gripped in my hand, dirty water dripping onto the floor. He crouched down then, bringing himself to my level, and I could smell him, like old books and rain and something metallic underneath. He reached out one pale hand, and I thought, this is it. This is how I die. But he didn't touch me. His fingers stopped just inches from my cheek, hovering there as if blocked by an invisible barrier. He told me he couldn't remember the last time he'd been curious about anything. He explained that immortality was like that. After the 1st century, everything became repetitive. After the 2nd, boring. After the 7th, unbearable. He said he'd spent the last 200 years trying to find something, anything, that could make him feel something other than the endless, crushing weight of forever. And then he looked at me, really looked at me, and told me he thought I might be the answer to a question he'd forgotten how to ask. Then he stood up and walked away, leaving me kneeling there in the puddle of dirty water, my entire world tilted on its axis. That was the first night, the first of many. He started appearing whenever I was working alone. At first, it was terrifying. I would be scrubbing floors in the portrait gallery, and suddenly he'd be there, standing among the paintings of his ancestors, asking me what I thought of them. I'd be polishing silverware in the small hours before dawn, and he'd materialize in the doorway, wondering aloud what it felt like to be tired. His questions were strange, intensely personal, but never invasive in the way I'd expected. He didn't ask me where I came from or if I had a family. He asked me what color I thought of when I was happy. He asked me if I dreamed, and what those dreams tasted like. He asked me if I ever looked at the moon and felt like it was looking back. I started answering him. I don't know why. Maybe because he was the first person in 3 years who'd treated me like I was more than a cleaning implement. Maybe because there was something in his eyes, beneath the predatory stillness, that looked lonely in a way I understood. I told him happiness felt like gold to me, like honey in sunlight. I explained that I did dream, almost every night, and my dreams tasted like the bread my mother used to bake, sweet and warm and safe. I confessed that yes, I looked at the moon sometimes through the high windows, and yes, it felt like it was watching me, like it was the only witness to my existence in that place of shadows. He listened to everything with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. He never moved closer, never touched me, always kept that invisible distance between us, but his attention was absolute. When Lucian Ashbourne listened, it felt like the entire universe had paused to hear what you had to say. Weeks passed like this, then months. The other servants began to notice, though they were too afraid to speak of it directly. Margot pulled me aside one morning and asked me if I understood what I was doing. She reminded me that vampires didn't form friendships with humans. They formed obsessions, and obsessions, she warned, never ended well for the human involved. But I couldn't stop, and I think, deep down, I didn't want to, because something strange was happening. Lucian was changing. It was subtle at first, a softness around his eyes when he looked at me, a careful gentleness in how he moved when I was near. He started bringing me things. A book of poetry he thought I might like, a flower from the night garden that bloomed only under stars. Once, impossibly, a small vial of captured sunlight that glowed gold in the darkness. He explained he'd paid a witch an exorbitant sum for that last one. He told me he wanted me to have it because he remembered what sunlight looked like, but he couldn't remember any more what it felt like. He thought maybe if I held it, I could remember for both of us. I cried that night, after he left. I held that vial of liquid gold and cried for the first time since I'd arrived at the castle. Not from fear or sadness, but from something more complicated. Because I was beginning to understand what Margot had warned me about. Lucian Ashbourne was falling in love with me. And God help me, I was falling in love with him too. It was absurd, impossible, dangerous beyond measure. He was a vampire, a creature who'd lived for centuries by feeding on people like me. I was a servant, a human whose only value in that castle was in the strength of my arms and the blood in my veins. We existed in completely different worlds, by completely different rules. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when he would sit on the floor beside me while I worked and tell me stories of the world before, of empires that had risen and fallen, of wars fought over causes long forgotten, of loves he'd witnessed that had burned bright and brief as shooting stars, none of that seemed to matter. I learned things about him that I don't think anyone else knew. He told me he'd been human once, so long ago that he could barely remember it. A scholar, he said, obsessed with unlocking the secrets of immortality. He'd succeeded, obviously, but he explained that success came with a price he hadn't fully understood until it was too late. He described what it was like to watch everyone you loved age and die while you remained unchanged. What it felt like to lose your sense of taste, of smell, of all the small pleasures that made life worth living. He told me that vampires didn't need blood to survive. That was a myth. They could exist indefinitely without it, but without blood, without that connection to life, they slowly went mad. They became hollow things, shells of consciousness with nothing inside but hunger and habit. He confessed that he'd been close to that edge more times than he could count, that he'd spent decades, sometimes centuries, in a state of numb emptiness, moving through existence like a sleepwalker. He said the other vampires in the castle were mostly like that now, ancient things going through the motions of unlife, hosting their gatherings not because they enjoyed them, but because they didn't know what else to do with eternity. But then, he told me, looking at me with those shifting silver eyes, he'd found me. And for the first time in 200 years, he felt curious, interested, almost alive. I asked him once why he thought I was different, what it was about my blood that called to him when thousands of others hadn't. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he explained that every human's blood carries the essence of their life within it, their experiences, their emotions, their vitality. Most people, he said, even good people, carry shadows in their blood. Fear, regret, resentment, small cruelties. It gave the blood a bitter undertone that vampires had learned to overlook. But my blood, he told me, tasted like sunlight. Not literally, he clarified, seeing my confusion. But it carried warmth, genuine warmth, despite everything I'd been through. It held hope. And hope, he said, was the rarest thing in the world. It was certainly the rarest thing in that castle. I told him I didn't feel hopeful most of the time. I felt scared and exhausted and trapped. He smiled at that, a real smile that showed just the barest hint of fangs, and he assured me that was exactly his point. Despite everything, being taken from my family, living in a castle of monsters, cleaning up the aftermath of their feeding, I still carried light inside me. I still got up every morning and scrubbed those floors. I still looked at the moon and found it beautiful. I still dreamed of my mother's bread. That light, he told me, was what he'd been searching for. It was what he'd lost centuries ago and thought he'd never find again. We were in the portrait gallery when he told me this, surrounded by paintings of lords and ladies long dead. The candles were burning low, and dawn was maybe an hour away. I remember looking at him, this ancient, powerful creature who could kill me with a thought, and seeing something achingly human in his expression. I asked him if he envied me. If he envied humans, his answer was immediate. He told me yes. He explained that he envied our mortality more than we could possibly understand, because mortality gave everything meaning. When you only had 70 or 80 years, every moment mattered. Every sunrise was precious. Every love was urgent. Every meal was savored. But when you had forever, he said, nothing mattered. Everything lost its significance. Love became just another way to pass time. Beauty became mundane. Even pain, which at least was something to feel, eventually became boring. He told me he would give anything, his power, his immortality, his centuries of knowledge, just to spend one day as human again, to taste food, to feel tired, to know that his time was limited and therefore precious. I didn't know what to say to that, so I did something incredibly stupid. I reached out and touched his hand. It was the first time I'd ever touched him, the first time either of us had crossed that invisible boundary he'd maintained. His skin was cold, so cold it almost burned, but he didn't pull away. He stared at my hand on his like it was a miracle, like it was something impossible made real. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that terrified me more than any of his predatory stillness ever had. I saw vulnerability. I saw need. I saw 700 years of loneliness cracking open like an egg. He told me softly that I was playing a dangerous game. He warned me that vampires didn't do anything by halves. Not love, not obsession, not possession. He said if I continued down this path with him, there would be consequences. Other vampires would notice. They would become interested. And some of them, he told me gravely, were not as controlled as he was. I should have listened. God, I should have pulled back right then, should have remembered my place, should have returned to being invisible. But I didn't. Because I'd been invisible for 3 years, and I was tired of it. And because when I looked at Lucian Ashbourne, I didn't just see a vampire. I saw someone as trapped as I was, just in a different kind of cage. So I squeezed his hand and told him I understood. And I meant it. The next few weeks were some of the strangest and most beautiful of my life. Lucian didn't just visit me while I worked anymore. He started finding reasons for me to be reassigned to different areas of the castle, places where we could talk more freely. He arranged for me to tend the night gardens, which meant I was often alone among the silver flowers and shadow-blooming vines. He'd meet me there, and we'd walk the paths together, talking about everything and nothing. He showed me his private library, a massive room filled with books in languages I couldn't read, some so old the pages crumbled at a touch. He read to me sometimes, translating ancient poetry into words I could understand. His favorite was a poem written by a long-dead Persian scholar about the tragedy of wanting to hold sunlight in your hands. I told him about my life before the castle. About my father, who'd been a woodcarver and had taught me to see the hidden shapes in every piece of timber. About my mother, who'd sung while she worked and had the most beautiful laugh I'd ever heard. About Thomas, my baby brother, who'd collected rocks and had dreamed of becoming a scholar. Lucian listened to all of it with that absolute attention. And then he did something unexpected. He offered to find out what had happened to Thomas. He explained he had connections throughout the kingdom, ways of gathering information that humans didn't possess. If my brother was alive, he told me, he could discover where and how. I broke down then. I couldn't help it. For 3 years, I'd convinced myself that my family was gone, that Thomas had probably been taken in the next collection, that my mother had died of her illness, that I was completely alone in the world. The possibility that I might be able to know, to have some certainty, was overwhelming. He held me while I cried. His arms were cold and his chest didn't rise with breath, but he held me anyway, one hand stroking my hair with a gentleness I wouldn't have believed him capable of. 2 weeks later, he brought me news. Thomas was alive. He was 19 now, working as an apprentice to a blacksmith 3 villages over. Our mother had passed 2 years ago, peacefully in her sleep, and Thomas had married just that spring to a girl named Elena, and they were expecting their first child. I sobbed with relief and grief all tangled together. My brother was alive. He was safe. He was building a life, and I would never see him again. Lucian sat with me through all of it, patient as stone, until I'd cried myself empty. Then he told me something I'll never forget. He said that my love for my brother, even separated by years and miles, was one of the most purely beautiful things he'd encountered in his entire existence. He told me that kind of love, that selfless hope for another person's happiness even at the cost of your own, was what made humanity worth preserving. I asked him if vampires could love like that. He was quiet for a long time. Then he admitted he didn't know. He explained that vampires could certainly become obsessed, possessive, devoted. But love in the way I meant, wanting someone's happiness even above your own existence, he wasn't sure. He thought maybe they'd lost that capacity along with their humanity. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and told me he'd spent the last century believing he was incapable of feeling anything real. But now he wasn't so sure, because when he thought about me, about my well-being, about my happiness, it hurt in a way he couldn't remember feeling before. And he thought maybe that hurt was what love felt like when you'd forgotten how to recognize it. I kissed him then. I know I shouldn't have. I know it was foolish and dangerous and broke every rule that kept servants alive in that place, but I did it anyway. His lips were cold against mine, and he went absolutely still, as if afraid that any movement might shatter the moment. Then, carefully, he kissed me back. Gently, so gently, like I was made of glass. When we pulled apart, he looked at me with something like wonder in his ancient eyes. He warned me again, his voice rough. He told me we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He said other vampires would sense the change in him, in how he smelled when he was near me, in how he moved through the castle. He explained that to them, it would look like weakness, and in their world, weakness invited challenge. I asked him if he wanted to stop, if he wanted me to go back to being invisible. He laughed at that, a sound I'd never heard from him before, bitter and sad and achingly human. He told me it was far too late for that. He said he'd been damned from the moment he first noticed the way candlelight caught in my hair. He explained he'd tried to stay away, had fought against his curiosity for months before finally approaching me, but it hadn't worked. And now, having known me, having talked with me, having felt what it was like to care about someone again, he couldn't go back. He didn't want to, so we didn't stop. We became more careful, more discreet, but we didn't stop. For 6 more months, we existed in this strange, secret world. I would do my work during the day, sleeping in the servants' quarters, maintaining my invisible facade. But at night, in the hours between midnight and dawn, I was his. We met in the library, in the gardens, sometimes in his chambers in the highest tower, where no other vampire dared venture without invitation. He taught me things: how to read the old languages, how to recognize different types of vampires by their eyes and the way they moved, how to defend myself if I needed to, though he admitted that against a vampire, human strength was virtually useless. Still, he showed me the vulnerable points, the places where even vampires could be hurt. I taught him things too, though I didn't realize it at the time. I taught him how to laugh again, really laugh. How to find joy in small things, the pattern of frost on a window, the smell of old books, the sound of rain on stone. I taught him, or maybe reminded him, what it felt like to care about someone else's pain more than your own. I thought it could last. God help me. I actually thought we could maintain this careful balance forever. But nothing lasts forever, not even in a castle of immortals. His name was Mordecai Thorne, and he was the second oldest vampire in Castle Noctis. Where Lucian was controlled and contemplative, Mordecai was impulsive and cruel. He was the one who hosted the most excessive gatherings, who took the most pleasure in the hunt, who saw humans as nothing more than amusing toys. I'd managed to avoid his attention for 3 years, but I couldn't avoid it forever. It was a Friday night. I remember because Fridays were usually quiet. Most of the vampires went out into the countryside to hunt, preferring fresh prey to the servants. I was cleaning the grand hall, alone except for Margot, who was working on the other side of the massive room. I heard the doors open but didn't look up. That was rule 1. Never make eye contact unless directly addressed. I kept scrubbing, kept my head down, kept breathing steady. Footsteps crossed the hall, rapid and purposeful. They stopped right in front of me. I saw expensive boots, black leather worked with silver thread. My stomach dropped. A voice spoke above me, smooth and cold as winter ice. Mordecai told me to look at him. I had no choice. I raised my head. Mordecai Thorne was beautiful in the way poisonous things are beautiful. Sharp features, pale skin, eyes so dark they looked black in the candlelight. He was smiling, showing fangs, and there was nothing friendly in that expression. He told me he'd been hearing interesting rumors. He said word among the castle was that Lord Ashbourne had taken a particular interest in one of the human servants, a cleaning girl, specifically. And he'd been curious to see what all the fuss was about. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat had closed up with terror. He crouched down, mimicking the way Lucian had that first night, but where Lucian's presence had been curious, Mordecai's was predatory. He looked me over like I was a cut of meat he was considering purchasing. He told me he could see the appeal. Young, healthy, probably tasty. But he said he didn't understand what made me special enough to catch Ashbourne's attention. He wondered aloud if maybe Lucian was simply getting soft in his old age. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He reached out and grabbed my chin, forcing my head back, exposing my throat. His hand was like ice, his grip painful. I could feel his breath on my skin, cold and dead and wrong. He told me he was going to find out what made me so interesting. He said he was going to taste me himself, right there, and see if my blood was really as special as Lucian seemed to think. I was going to die. I knew it with absolute certainty. Margot was too far away to help, and even if she wasn't, what could she do against a vampire? I closed my eyes and tried to think of something good, something beautiful to hold on to in my last moments. But the bite never came. Instead, I heard a sound like thunder, and suddenly Mordecai was gone, ripped away from me with such force that I fell backward. I opened my eyes to see him sprawled across the hall, a crack in the marble floor where he'd impacted. And standing between us, trembling with barely contained rage, was Lucien. I'd never seen him like that. His eyes weren't silver anymore. They were black, completely black, like holes in reality. His fangs were fully extended. He looked like the monster he'd always been but had hidden so carefully. He looked terrifying. He spoke to Mordecai, his voice so low and dangerous it made the air vibrate. He told him to leave. Now. Mordecai got to his feet, brushing stone dust from his clothes. He was smiling, but it was a wary smile now. He asked Lucian if he was really willing to fight over a human. He pointed out that they were disposable, replaceable. He said there were dozens just like me in the servants' quarters. Lucian's response was simple. He told Mordecai that this one was his, and if he touched her again, it would be the last thing he ever did. The two vampires stared at each other, and I could feel the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. I thought they were going to fight right there, was already imagining the castle walls crumbling around their violence. But Mordecai backed down. He raised his hands in mock surrender and told Lucian he didn't want any trouble. He said he'd just been curious. That was all. No harm done. But as he turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. He looked back at me, then at Lucian, and he said something that made my blood run cold. He told Lucian that claiming a human as property was one thing, the others could accept that. But caring about one, actually caring, that was weakness. And weakness, he reminded him, was something the council wouldn't tolerate in their founder. Then he left, and the hall fell into terrible silence. Lucian stood there for a long moment, his back to me, his shoulders tense. I could see him fighting to control himself, fighting to push back the monster he'd just revealed. Finally, slowly, the blackness faded from his eyes, and his fangs retracted. He turned to me, and what I saw in his face broke my heart. Fear. Not for himself, but for me. He crossed to me in 2 quick strides and dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over me but not quite touching, as if he was afraid he'd hurt me. He asked if I was okay, if Mordecai had hurt me, if I was injured. I told him I was fine, just scared. Then I asked him what he'd done, what had he risked for me. His expression was bleak. He explained that he'd just declared open protection over me, which was within his rights as the castle's founder. But Mordecai was right. He'd shown too much emotion, too much investment. The other vampires would see it as a weakness to be exploited. I asked him what would happen now. He helped me to my feet, and I noticed his hands were shaking, something I'd never seen before. He told me he wasn't sure, but it wouldn't be good. The council, the ruling body of the oldest vampires, would hear about this. They would question his judgment, and they would definitely take an interest in me. Margot appeared then, her face pale with fear. She looked between us and told us we needed to leave. Now, before anyone else came. She reminded Lucian that there were protocols, ways this should be handled if he wanted to protect me properly. Lucian nodded and told her to take me to his quarters. He said no one would dare enter without his permission, that I'd be safe there while he dealt with the council. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and told me not to leave his rooms no matter what I heard or what anyone told me. He made me promise. I promised. He touched my face then, just once, his cold fingers gentle against my cheek. He told me he was sorry. He said he'd tried to prevent this, had tried to keep me safe, but he'd failed. He promised he would fix this somehow. Then he was gone, moving with that impossible vampire speed, and Margot was pulling me toward the tower stairs. She didn't speak as we climbed, just kept pulling me upward, floor after floor, until we reached a door at the very top. She knocked 3 times, then twice, then once. Some kind of code. The door swung open on its own. Lucien's quarters were not what I expected. I'd imagined something dark and gothic, all heavy furniture and crimson drapes. Instead, it was almost bare. Stone walls with shelves of books, a simple desk covered in papers, a large window that looked out over the mountains, and no bed, because of course he didn't need one. Margot pushed me inside and told me to stay there, to not open the door for anyone but Lucien. Then she hesitated, her hand on the doorframe, and she looked at me with something like pity. She told me she understood why I'd done it, why I'd let myself fall for him. She admitted that Lucian Ashbourne was probably the only vampire in the castle who still had any humanity left in him. But she said that didn't change what he was, and it didn't change what was coming. I asked her what she meant. She explained that the council wouldn't kill me. I was Lucian's claimed property now, and killing me would be a direct challenge to his authority. But they would test him. They would push and prod and see how far his attachment went. And if they decided he was too weak, too compromised by human emotion, they would remove him from power. And then, she said quietly, there would be nothing to stop them from doing whatever they wanted with me. She left me with that cheerful thought, closing the door behind her. I heard a lock click into place. Whether to keep others out or me in, I wasn't sure. I spent the next several hours in that room, pacing, terrified, imagining every horrible possibility. What if Mordecai challenged Lucian to a fight? What if the council decided to make an example of him? What if they turned me into a vampire against my will, just to prove a point? But underneath the fear was something else. Guilt. Because Lucian had risked everything. His position, his safety, maybe even his existence, to protect me. And for what? Because I'd been stupid enough to kiss him. Because I couldn't maintain the distance he'd tried so hard to keep. I was so lost in these thoughts that I almost didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs. Multiple sets of footsteps, coming closer. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering. The footsteps stopped outside. I heard voices, low and muffled through the thick wood. Then a voice I didn't recognize, cold and ancient, called out to me. It told me to open the door, that the council wished to speak with me. I remembered my promise to Lucian. I told them I couldn't, that I was under orders to stay inside. There was a pause, then something that might have been laughter. The voice told me it wasn't a request. It explained that Lucian was currently occupied with council business and had granted them permission to speak with me. I knew it was a lie. Lucian would never grant them that. But what could I do? I was human, trapped at the top of a tower, and there were vampires outside who could tear through that door like paper if they chose to. I told them again that I was under orders to stay inside until Lucien returned. More silence. Then a different voice spoke, smoother, more persuasive. This voice suggested that I was being very foolish. It pointed out that I was making the situation worse for Lucien by defying the council. It told me if I just opened the door and answered a few simple questions, this could all be resolved peacefully. I didn't respond. I just stood there, staring at the door, trying to breathe steadily. Then I heard a new sound. Scratching. Something was scratching at the door, slowly, deliberately. The sound sent chills down my spine because it was clear they were making a point. They could get in whenever they wanted. They were choosing to wait. I looked around the room desperately for something, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on the desk, on a letter opener made of what looked like silver. I grabbed it, knowing how useless it would be but needing to hold something. That's when I heard it. A roar that shook the entire tower, followed by the sound of bodies hitting stone. The scratching stopped immediately. Lucian's voice, filled with a rage I'd never heard before, told them to get away from his door. He asked them if they'd lost their minds, if they thought the council's authority extended to invading his private quarters. A new voice responded, older than any I'd heard before, speaking with the weight of centuries. This voice, which I later learned belonged to Cassian, the head of the council, told Lucian to calm himself. They'd simply been trying to speak with the girl, to understand what made her so special that he would risk everything for her. Lucian's response was ice cold. He told them there was nothing to understand. She was under his protection, and that was the end of it. Cassian made a thoughtful sound. He pointed out that protection was one thing, but what Lucian had displayed earlier looked remarkably like love. And love, he reminded him, was a human emotion, one that Lucian should have outgrown centuries ago. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart in my throat, waiting for Lucian's response. He was quiet for a moment. Then he admitted it. He told them yes. Perhaps it was love. Perhaps after 700 years of existence, he'd finally found something that made immortality feel less like a curse, and he asked them what business it was of theirs. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Cassian spoke again, his voice softer now, almost sad. He explained to Lucien that they'd all been where he was. Every vampire who'd lived long enough had tried to hold on to humanity by loving a mortal, but it never ended well. The human aged and died, or they returned and lost what made them special, or they were killed by a rival. Always, always, it ended in pain. He told Lucian he was trying to save him from that pain. Lucian's response was bitter. He said he appreciated the concern, but he'd already lived through every kind of pain existence could offer. This, at least, was a pain that came with joy, that came with meaning. Cassian told him he was being a fool. Lucian agreed. He said yes, probably he was. But he said it was his choice to make, his foolishness to embrace. And unless the council wanted to formally challenge his authority, they would respect that choice. More silence. I could almost feel the tension through the heavy door, the weight of unspoken threats and ancient power dynamics I couldn't begin to understand. Finally, Cassian spoke one last time. He told Lucien they would respect his claim. For now. But he warned him that other vampires would not be so understanding. Mordecai, in particular, would see this as an opportunity. And when, not if, when, something happened to the girl, Lucian would have no one to blame but himself. Then I heard footsteps retreating, descending the stairs, until there was only silence. A soft knock on the door. Lucian's voice, tired now, telling me it was safe to open it. I unlocked the door with shaking hands. Lucian stood there, and he looked more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. Not physically tired. Vampires didn't get tired that way. But there was something drained in his expression, something worn. He came inside and closed the door behind him, leaning against it as if he needed the support. He told me he'd bought us time, but not much. The council had agreed not to interfere, but that wouldn't stop individual vampires from making their own moves. I asked him what we were going to do. He looked at me with those silver eyes, and I saw the conflict warring in them. He told me there were really only 3 options. First, he could wipe my memory and have me sent to a different household, somewhere far from Castle Noctis. I'd be safe, but I'd forget everything. Forget him, forget us, forget the last 3 years entirely. My heart clenched at that. I told him no, absolutely not. He nodded as if he'd expected that response. Second option, he continued, was to turn me, make me vampire. I'd be immortal, powerful, beyond the reach of most threats. But, he said, looking away, I would lose the very thing that made me special. That warmth in my blood, that hope, that humanity. All of it would be gone. I'd be just another vampire, and whatever it was that he felt for me, it would likely fade within a century or 2. I asked about the third option. His expression turned bleak. He told me the third option was to do nothing and hope we could hold out. Keep me under his protection, keep me hidden as much as possible, and pray that no one challenged us strongly enough to force a confrontation. I pointed out that didn't sound like much of an option at all. He laughed at that, hollow and sad. He agreed. He said none of the options were good, but they were all we had. I crossed to him then and took his cold hands in mine. I told him I'd already made my choice. I wasn't leaving, I wasn't forgetting, and I wasn't becoming a vampire. If we only had a short time together, then we'd make the most of it. He looked at me like I was insane. He reminded me that short time for humans was very short indeed. He said even with his protection, I might have months at best before someone found a way around his authority. I told him I understood, and I told him that months with him, truly with him, was worth more than a lifetime of invisible safety. He pulled me into his arms then, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. He pressed his face into my hair and told me I was going to break his heart. He said I was going to die, probably sooner than later, and it was going to destroy him in a way 700 years of existence hadn't managed to do. I told him I was sorry, and I meant it. But I also told him that loving someone meant accepting the risk of loss. That was what made it love instead of possession. He held me for a long time after that, neither of us speaking, just existing together in that moment. Eventually, he pulled back and looked at me with something that might have been resolve. He told me if we were going to do this, truly do this, then we needed to be smart. He said he'd teach me everything he could about vampire society, about how to protect myself, about the castle's hidden passages and safe rooms. He explained that knowledge was the only weapon I'd have, and he was going to make sure I had as much of it as possible. And that's what we did. For the next 2 months, I lived in that tower room. Lucian told the other vampires I was too valuable to risk in the general servant population, that I was being kept secured for his exclusive use. It wasn't exactly a lie, though the truth was far more complicated. During the nights, he taught me. He showed me maps of the castle, including rooms and passages that weren't on any official plans. He taught me which vampires could be reasoned with and which ones would kill first and ask questions never. He explained the complex politics of vampire hierarchy, the old grudges and alliances that governed their society. He taught me about vampire weaknesses too. Sunlight would kill them, obviously, but there were other things. Silver burned their skin. Certain herbs could weaken them temporarily. A wooden stake through the heart wouldn't kill them like in the stories, but it would paralyze them. Decapitation, he said matter-of-factly, worked on pretty much everything. I asked him why he was telling me all this, why he was essentially giving me a manual on how to kill his own kind. He told me because if something happened to him, if he couldn't protect me anymore, he wanted me to be able to protect myself, even if that meant protecting myself from other vampires. But it wasn't all lessons and preparation. We had moments of peace, too. He'd read to me from his ancient books, translating as he went. We'd stand at the window and watch the stars wheel overhead, and he'd tell me stories about what the world had been like in different eras. Sometimes we'd just sit together in silence, my hand in his, existing in that strange bubble of peace we'd created. I knew it couldn't last. We both knew it. But for those 2 months, we pretended it could. The end, when it came from an unexpected direction. there was a new vampire who'd arrived at Castle Noctis. His name was Severin Drake, and he was young by vampire standards, only about a century old. Young vampires were dangerous in a different way than ancient ones. They still had human impulses, human emotions, but none of the control that came with age. They were volatile, unpredictable. Severin had heard about me, of course. Everyone in the castle had by that point Lucien's human pet, they called me. Some with derision, some with curiosity, a few with outright malice. But Severin was different. He didn't want to hurt me out of spite or political maneuvering. He wanted me because he believed I could save him. Lucien told me about him one night, his expression troubled. He explained that Severin was on the edge of losing himself, that spiral into madness that came when vampires couldn't cope with immortality. He'd heard the rumors about me, about my blood tasting like sunlight, about the effect I'd had on Lucien. And he'd convinced himself that if he could have me, turn me, make me his, he could stave off the emptiness that was consuming him. I asked Lucien if that was true, if I could help Severin the way I'd helped him. Lucien's answer was complicated. He said maybe, in theory. But he explained that what existed between us had taken time to develop. It wasn't just my blood or my humanity. It was connection, understanding, genuine care built over months of conversation and shared moments. Severin wanted a shortcut, wanted to consume what I was, rather than know who I was. And that, Lucien said, would destroy us both. I asked him what Severin was going to do. Lucien admitted he didn't know. Severin had formally requested a meeting to discuss the possibility of a trade, wealth, knowledge, power, whatever Lucien wanted in exchange for me. Lucien had refused, obviously, but that didn't mean Severin would accept that refusal. I suggested maybe I could talk to Severin, explain that it didn't work the way he thought. Lucien looked at me like I'd suggested juggling torches. He told me absolutely not. He reminded me that young vampires had even less control than old ones, that Severin could kill me in a moment of frustration or simply drain me trying to get at that sunlight in my blood. He made me promise I wouldn't go near Severin, wouldn't respond if he tried to contact me. I promised, and at the time, I meant it. But 3 days later, I found a letter slipped under the door. It was written in a shaking hand, the words sometimes smudged as if the writer had been crying. The letter was from Severin. He told me he knew I probably thought he was a monster. He admitted he probably was. But he explained what it was like, being a vampire, feeling yourself hollow out bit by bit, until there was nothing left but hunger and habit. He described the fear of looking in the mirror and seeing nothing behind your own eyes. He told me he didn't want to hurt me. He just wanted to understand. He wanted to know how I'd reached Lucien when nothing else had in 7 centuries. He wanted to know if there was hope for him too, or if he should just walk into the sun and end it. The letter broke my heart, because underneath the vampire, underneath the predator, was someone who was suffering in a way I could barely imagine, someone who'd once been human and had lost it and was desperately trying to find it again. I did something stupid. I know I did. I knew it even then. But I couldn't help myself. I wrote back. I told him I understood feeling lost. I explained that I didn't have any magic solution, that what existed between Lucien and me had grown naturally from conversation and time. But I told him if he wanted to talk, just talk like people, I would try to help him understand. I slipped the letter under my door, hoping it would reach him the same way his had reached me. It did. And 2 nights later, when Lucien was occupied with council business, Severin Drake appeared at my window. The window was 4 stories up, but of course that meant nothing to a vampire. He perched on the ledge outside, not entering, he couldn't without invitation, and looked at me through the glass. He was younger than I expected, or at least he looked younger. Maybe 25 when he'd been turned, with dark hair and eyes that would have been handsome if they weren't so desperately sad. He told me thank you for responding to his letter. He said no one had treated him like a person in longer than he could remember. He asked if we could talk, just for a little while. I knew I should send him away. I knew Lucien would be furious if he found out. But I saw something in Severin's expression that I recognized. The same lonely desperation I'd seen in Lucien those first few months. The look of someone drowning and hoping someone might throw them a rope. So I talked to him. Not about anything important, just small things. I asked him about his life before he was turned, what he remembered about being human. He told me he'd been a musician, a violinist, and the thing he missed most was the way music used to make him feel. He explained that vampires could still hear music, but it didn't touch them the way it once had. It was just sound now, no emotion behind it. I told him about my mother's singing, about how she could make the saddest songs sound hopeful, about how I still heard her voice sometimes when I was falling asleep. We talked like that for maybe an hour. Him outside on the ledge, me inside the room, a pane of glass between us like a metaphor for everything that separated our worlds. Eventually, he asked the question I knew was coming. He wanted to know what made me different, what it was about me that had reached Lucian. I told him honestly that I didn't know. I explained that I thought maybe it wasn't anything special about me specifically. Maybe Lucian had just been ready to feel something again, and I happened to be there at the right time. Severin looked disappointed, but he nodded as if he'd expected that answer. He told me he appreciated my honesty. Then he said something that chilled me. He told me he'd made up his mind. He said he was going to walk into the sunrise in 3 days. He'd already made his preparations, written his letters. He just wanted to talk to someone one last time, to remember what connection felt like before the end. I asked him not to. I told him there had to be another way, that maybe with time he could find what he was looking for. He smiled at that, sad and bitter. He told me time was the problem. When you had infinite time, waiting became unbearable. He said he'd already waited a century, and he couldn't wait anymore. Then he thanked me again and disappeared into the night, moving so fast I couldn't track him. I stood at that window for a long time afterward, feeling sick. I'd thought I was helping, thought I could offer some kind of hope. Instead, I just confirmed for him that there was no easy answer, no quick fix for the emptiness inside him. When Lucian returned an hour later, I told him everything. I expected him to be angry, but instead he just looked tired. He told me Severin had been planning this for months, that the council had known and done nothing because a vampire's choice to end their existence was considered their own business. I asked him if there was anything we could do. He told me no. He said Severin had made his choice, and none of us had the right to take that from him. 3 days later, just as Severin had promised, he walked out onto the eastern terrace at dawn. I didn't see it happen, but Lucian did. He told me later that it was quick. The sunrise turned him to ash in seconds. But there was something peaceful in Severin's expression at the end, something almost grateful. The castle felt different after that, darker somehow, heavier. Or maybe that was just my perception, because Severin's death had shown me something I'd been trying not to see. Immortality wasn't the gift it appeared to be. It was a burden, a curse, a prison that most vampires endured rather than enjoyed. And Lucian had been in that prison for 700 years. I asked him one night if he'd ever considered doing what Severin had done, walking into the sun. He didn't answer right away. We were in his quarters, me sitting in the window seat, him standing by the bookshelves. Finally, he admitted that yes, he'd considered it, many times, especially in those long periods of emptiness when centuries would pass without anything of note happening. He told me the only thing that had stopped him was curiosity. What if something interesting happened tomorrow? What if next year brought something worth experiencing? What if, after all this time, something could still surprise him? Then he looked at me and told me I'd been that something, that surprise he'd been waiting centuries for. I didn't know how to respond to that. The weight of it was crushing, knowing that I was the thing keeping him tethered to existence, that when I died, he might follow Severin into the sunrise. He must have seen it in my face because he crossed to me quickly and knelt beside the window seat. He told me not to think like that, not to make my mortality into a burden. He said whatever happened, whenever it happened, he was grateful. These months with me had been worth more than all the centuries before combined. I touched his face, his cold, perfect face, and told him I loved him. It was the first time either of us had said it out loud. We'd danced around it, implied it, shown it in 1,000 small ways. But neither of us had spoken the actual words. He closed his eyes like I'd hurt him. Then he opened them and told me he loved me too. He said he'd loved me from the moment I'd explained what color happiness was, maybe even before that. He told me it was inconvenient and dangerous, and probably the worst thing that could have happened to either of us. But he said he wouldn't trade it for anything. We kissed then, deep and desperate, like we were trying to make up for all the time we knew we wouldn't have. His hands were careful on my face, my shoulders, always so careful not to hurt me with his vampire strength, and I held him as tightly as I could, trying to prove that I wasn't afraid of what he was. That night was the last peaceful one we had. The next evening, when Lucian left for what should have been a short council meeting, Mordecai made his move. I was alone in the tower, reading one of Lucian's books, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Multiple sets, moving quickly. I stood up, my heart already racing, and looked around for anything I could use as a weapon. The door burst open, literally burst, the lock shattering under vampire strength. And there stood Mordecai Thorne with two other vampires I didn't recognize. He smiled at me, that cruel, cold smile, and told me Lord Ashbourne had requested my presence at the council meeting. He said I was to come immediately. I knew it was a lie. Lucian would never request that, would never put me in that situation. But what could I do? There were 3 vampires between me and the only exit. I told Mordecai I would need to get dressed properly. I was in sleeping clothes. I was stalling, hoping desperately that Lucian would somehow know, would somehow sense I was in danger. Mordecai laughed and told me that wouldn't be necessary. He said where I was going, appearance didn't matter. One of the other vampires moved forward, reaching for me. I remembered Lucian's lessons and dodged, grabbing the silver letter opener from the desk and slashing at the vampire's outstretched hand. The silver burned him, made him hiss and pull back. But it also made Mordecai's expression darken. He told me I was making this harder than it needed to be. He explained they could do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, I was coming with them. I asked him where he was taking me. His smile widened. He told me somewhere that Ashbourne couldn't follow, somewhere that would prove once and for all that his attachment to me was a weakness that couldn't be tolerated. They were going to kill me. Not directly, that would be too obvious a challenge, but they were going to put me somewhere Lucian couldn't reach, somewhere he'd have to choose between his position and my life, and they were betting he'd choose me. I held up the silver letter opener, knowing how pathetic it was but not having any other options. I told them Lucian would destroy them for this. Mordecai shrugged. He said maybe, maybe not. But he told me either way. It would be worth it to watch the great Lucian Ashbourne finally break. The vampire I'd cut made another grab for me, faster this time. I slashed again, but he was ready for it. He caught my wrist and squeezed, and I felt bones grind together. The letter opener clattered to the floor. I screamed, more from fear than pain, hoping someone would hear, would come investigate. Mordecai moved then, so fast I couldn't track it, and his hand clamped over my mouth. He told me to be quiet, that screaming would only make this worse. His other hand grabbed my arm, and suddenly we were moving, impossibly fast, downstairs and through corridors I'd never seen before. I tried to fight, tried to slow them down, but it was useless. Vampire strength was overwhelming. I was like a rag doll in their grip, helpless to stop whatever they had planned. We emerged into a part of the castle I didn't recognize, older than the rest, colder, the walls rough-hewn stone instead of polished marble. Mordecai dragged me through a heavy door and down a spiral staircase that descended deep into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, and I could smell damp and decay. We were going into the dungeons, I realized, the old dungeons that hadn't been used in centuries. At the bottom of the stairs was a corridor lined with cells. Iron doors rusted, but still solid. Mordecai pulled me to the last cell and threw me inside. I hit the stone floor hard, my already injured wrist screaming in protest. He stood in the doorway, backlit by torchlight, looking at me like I was an amusing curiosity. He told me to make myself comfortable. He said I'd be here a while. I asked him what he was going to do. He explained it cheerfully, like he was describing plans for a party. He said he'd sent word to Lucian that I'd been taken, along with a location, but not this location. A false one. Out in the forest. Lucian would go rushing out to save me, would leave the castle, would make himself vulnerable, and while he was gone, Mordecai would call a vote. A vote to remove Lucian from power on the grounds that his human attachment had compromised his judgment. With Lucian not present to defend himself, the vote would pass, and once he was no longer founder, no longer protected by his title, well, Mordecai said there were plenty of vampires who'd wanted him dead for centuries, but hadn't dared challenge him directly. I told him he was insane, that Lucien would see through this. Mordecai shrugged. He said maybe, but he told me Lucien was too far gone, too human in his feelings, too desperate to save me. He'd fall for it because he had to believe he could save me. That was what love did. It made you stupid, made you weak, made you vulnerable. Then he stepped back and slammed the cell door shut. The lock clanged into place with a finality that made my stomach drop. He told me through the bars that if everything went as planned, I'd die down here. Not from them, they wouldn't touch me directly. Just from thirst, from hunger, from cold, a natural death, nothing that could be traced back to anyone specific. I asked him what if Lucian survived? What if he came back? Mordecai's smile faded. He told me if that happened, then he'd deal with it, but he said it wouldn't happen. Lucian Ashbourne had survived 7 centuries because he was careful, controlled, rational, but now he was none of those things. Now he was just a man in love. And men in love, Mordecai said, died very easily. Then he left, taking the torch with him, plunging me into absolute darkness. I don't know how long I sat in that cell. Hours, certainly. Maybe longer. The darkness was complete, suffocating. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The only sounds were my own breathing and the drip of water somewhere in the distance. My wrist throbbed where the vampire had gripped it. I thought it might be broken. Every time I moved, pain shot up my arm. I tried not to panic, tried to think logically. Lucien was smart. He'd realize it was a trap. He wouldn't fall for Mordecai's scheme. But another part of me, the part that knew him, knew he would. Because Mordecai was right. Love made you stupid. And Lucian loved me enough to walk into any trap if he thought I might be on the other side of it. I thought about Severin, about walking into the sunrise, about how he'd said waiting was the hardest part. I understood that now. Waiting in the dark, not knowing if rescue was coming or if I was going to die alone in this forgotten cell. I thought about my brother Thomas, safe in his village with his wife and coming child. At least he was okay. At least something good had come from all this. I thought about my mother, and for the first time in years, I let myself imagine what she would say if she could see me now. Would she be disappointed? Would she tell me I'd been foolish for loving a vampire? Or would she understand that sometimes love wasn't a choice, wasn't logical, just was? I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke to the sound of distant shouting. It was far away, echoing through stone, but it was definitely voices, and one of them sounded like Lucian. Hope surged through me. I tried to stand, but my legs had gone numb from sitting on cold stone. I managed to get to my knees and crawled to the cell door. I shouted his name, over and over, my voice hoarse and desperate. The shouting got louder, closer. I heard fighting, the sound of stone cracking, of metal tearing. Then footsteps, running down the stairs. Light appeared at the end of the corridor, a torch bobbing toward me. And then there he was. Lucian looked like he'd been through a war. His clothes were torn, stained with blood, some red, some black. His face was spattered with it. His eyes were wild, black with fury and fear. He saw me and something in his expression broke. He crossed to the cell door and simply tore it off its hinges, the iron screeching in protest. Then he was inside, pulling me into his arms, holding me so tightly I couldn't breathe. He asked me if I was hurt, his hands running over me, checking for injuries. I told him my wrist, that I thought it might be broken. He cradled my arm carefully, examining it, his jaw clenched. He told me it was broken, but he could fix it. He said he was sorry, so sorry, that he'd fallen for it exactly like Mordecai had known he would. I asked him what had happened, if the vote had gone through. His expression went dark. He told me there hadn't been a vote, because when he'd realized it was a trap and turned back, when he'd discovered me missing and figured out where I really was, he'd torn through the castle until he found Mordecai. And then he'd done something he hadn't done in over 2 centuries. He'd killed another vampire. I stared at him, shocked. I knew vampire politics, knew that killing another vampire was one of the gravest offenses in their society. It didn't matter if Mordecai had started it, if he'd been planning murder. Lucian had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I asked him what that meant for him. He told me simply that it meant we had to leave. Now. Tonight. Because by dawn, every vampire in Castle Noctis would be hunting him, and by extension, hunting me. He helped me to my feet, supporting my weight when my legs wobbled. He wrapped his cloak around me. I was still in sleeping clothes, and picked me up as if I weighed nothing. Then he ran. I'd experienced vampire speed before, but never like this. The world blurred around us, the castle passing in streaks of shadow and stone. We flew upstairs, through corridors, past startled servants who barely had time to register our presence. We burst out of the castle into the night, and Lucien didn't stop. He ran down the mountain, through forests, across streams, the landscape passing so quickly I couldn't track it. I just held on, my face buried against his shoulder, trusting him completely. I don't know how long we ran. Long enough that when he finally stopped, we were so far from the castle, I couldn't see it anymore. We were in a small clearing, the first hints of dawn starting to lighten the eastern sky. Lucian set me down carefully and looked at the horizon with an expression I couldn't read. I asked him what we were going to do, where we could go. He turned to me, and I saw the truth in his face before he spoke. He told me there was nowhere. Nowhere in the kingdom, maybe nowhere in the world, where the vampires wouldn't eventually find us. He'd killed one of their own, had broken the most sacred law of their society. They would hunt him until they destroyed him. I asked him about me, if they'd let me go if he was gone. He looked at me with such sadness. He said no, I knew too much. I'd lived in the castle, learned their secrets, seen their faces. And I was the reason Lucian had fallen, the weakness that had led to Mordecai's death. They wouldn't let me live, even if they let him die peacefully. So we were both dead. It was just a matter of time. I should have been terrified. I should have broken down, should have raged against the unfairness of it all. But instead, I felt strangely calm. I told Lucien I didn't regret it. Any of it. He touched my face, his cold fingers gentle against my skin. He told me he didn't either. He said these months with me had given him something he'd thought he'd lost forever. A reason to exist. A purpose beyond simply enduring. The sky was getting lighter. Pink and gold were starting to streak across the clouds. I watched Lucian's face as he looked at the coming dawn. There was no fear there, no dread, just a kind of peaceful resolution. He told me he had an idea. It wasn't a good idea, he said, but it was the only one he had. He asked me if I trusted him. I told him yes, absolutely, without hesitation. He explained that there was a place, not far from here, where a river ran deep and fast. If we went into that river together, if we let it carry us downstream, the vampires wouldn't be able to track our scent. Water confused their hunting abilities. We might be able to escape, might be able to find somewhere to hide, at least for a while. I pointed out that the sun was rising, that he couldn't survive in daylight. He nodded. He said he knew. He told me he'd have to go into the water before the sun fully rose, would have to stay submerged until nightfall. It would be painful, he warned, being conscious but paralyzed by the running water for hours. But he could survive it. The problem was me. I was human. I couldn't hold my breath for 12 hours. I couldn't survive being submerged that long. I asked him what he was suggesting. He took both my hands in his, careful of my broken wrist. He told me there was a vampire ability most humans didn't know about. Older vampires, ones with significant control, could put a human into a kind of stasis, a death-like state where heart and breathing slowed to almost nothing. It would let me survive underwater, would make me essentially dead to any vampire trying to track my life force. But, he warned, it was dangerous. If he miscalculated, if he pushed too hard, I could actually die. And if something happened to him while I was in stasis, I'd never wake up. I asked him what the alternative was. He admitted there wasn't one. We could run, but the vampires would catch us before nightfall. We could fight, but we'd lose. This was the only option that gave us even a small chance. The sun was cresting the horizon now. We had minutes, maybe seconds. I told him to do it. He pulled me close, and I felt his power wash over me like cold water. It was terrifying and overwhelming and intimate in a way I hadn't expected. I could feel him in my mind, in my blood, pulling me down into darkness. My heartbeat slowed. My breathing became shallow. The world started to fade at the edges. The last thing I saw was Lucian's face above mine, beautiful and terrible and full of love. The last thing I heard was him whispering that he would keep me safe, that he promised he'd wake me when it was over. Then there was nothing. I don't remember the water, don't remember being submerged. There was just darkness, empty and vast, like floating in a void. And then, slowly, consciousness returned. The first thing I felt was warmth. Actual warmth, sun on my skin. That didn't make sense. Vampires couldn't be in sunlight. I opened my eyes. I was lying on a riverbank, grass beneath me, the afternoon sun streaming through trees overhead. My clothes were soaked, my hair plastered to my face. My wrist still throbbed, but the pain was distant, muted. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. We'd made it. We were downstream from the castle, far downstream by the look of it. The river here was wider, calmer, bordered by willow trees that trailed their branches in the water. But where was Lucian? I called his name, panic rising in my chest. He should be here, should have woken me as soon as darkness fell. But the sun was still up, still bright in the western sky. It had to be 3 or 4 in the afternoon. I struggled to my feet, searching the riverbank. Maybe he'd found shelter, somewhere shaded where he could wait out the daylight. Maybe he was nearby, just hidden. That's when I saw him. He was in the water, just beneath the surface, about 10 feet from shore, completely still, eyes closed, his dark hair floating around his face like seaweed. For a horrible moment, I thought he was dead, truly dead, dissolved by sunlight or drowned or somehow destroyed. But then I understood. He'd stayed underwater, not just through the morning, but into the afternoon. He'd stayed submerged past dawn, past noon, into the height of day, because he couldn't risk coming out while the sun was still up. He was conscious. I knew he was conscious. Vampires didn't sleep, which meant he'd been lying there, aware, paralyzed by running water, for hours beyond what he'd planned. I waded into the river, gasping at the cold, and grabbed his arm. He was heavy, far heavier than he should have been, as if the water itself was weighing him down. I pulled with all my strength, dragging him toward shore. It took everything I had. My broken wrist screamed in protest. My muscles burned, but I didn't stop. Inch by inch, I hauled him through the shallows until finally, his head broke the surface. He gasped, an unnecessary reflex from his human days, and his eyes flew open. They were unfocused, wild, black with stress. I pulled him further, into the grass, out of the water completely. He collapsed onto the bank, shaking, his usual graceful control completely shattered. I knelt beside him, my hands on his face, telling him he was okay. He was out. It was going to be okay. It took several minutes for him to recover. Slowly, the trembling stopped. The blackness faded from his eyes, replaced by that familiar shifting silver. He focused on me, really focused, and relief flooded his expression. He asked me if I was all right, his voice hoarse. I almost laughed. I told him I was fine. But what about him? I asked him why he'd stayed under so long, why he hadn't surfaced as soon as night fell. He explained haltingly that he'd miscalculated. The stasis he'd put me in had been deeper than he'd intended, probably because of his emotional state. He'd had to maintain it longer than planned to ensure I survived. And while he was maintaining it, while his consciousness was split between his body and mine, he hadn't been able to move. By the time I'd started coming out of stasis naturally, the sun was already rising. He'd had to make a choice, surface and burn, or stay under and endure. I told him he was an idiot for risking himself like that. He smiled weakly and told me he'd made his choice a long time ago. My safety mattered more than his comfort. We rested there for a while, both of us exhausted in different ways. The sun crept lower, shadows lengthening across the riverbank. I used the time to fashion a crude splint for my wrist, using branches and strips torn from my ruined sleeping clothes. As dusk finally fell, Lucian sat up and looked around, assessing our surroundings. He told me we were about 30 miles downstream from the castle, which was good, but we still weren't far enough. The vampires would have started at dawn. We had to keep moving. I asked him where we could go. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he told me there was a town on the coast about a week's travel from here. It was a port city, always busy, always full of strangers coming and going. We might be able to lose ourselves there, at least for a while. He said it wasn't a permanent solution. Eventually, the vampires would find us. But it might buy us time. Maybe months, maybe a year if we were careful. I told him a year sounded good. A year sounded like forever compared to dying in that cell. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in his expression made my breath catch. He told me he'd been thinking, during those hours underwater, thinking about what I'd said before, about how mortality gave life meaning. He said he understood now, truly understood. Because for the first time in 700 years, his time felt limited. He might have months or a year or even a decade before the vampires found us, but he didn't have forever anymore. And somehow, that made every moment precious. He told me he was grateful for that, grateful that I'd given him back something he'd lost centuries ago, the urgency of finite time. I took his hand, lacing my fingers through his cold ones. I told him we should make the most of it then. Whatever time we had. He agreed, and then we started walking. That week of travel was strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. We moved only at night, Lucian's vampire speed letting us cover vast distances. During the day, we'd hide, in abandoned buildings, in caves, once in a barn where the farmer never knew we were there. Lucian taught me how to move quietly, how to hide our tracks. He showed me which roads to avoid, which towns had vampire populations we needed to steer clear of. He was different on the run, more alert, more alive somehow, as if the danger had woken something in him. We talked constantly during those long nights, about everything and nothing. He told me stories from centuries past, and I told him about my dreams for a future I'd never thought I'd have. We debated philosophy and argued about poetry and laughed at stupid jokes that weren't even funny. It felt like being young, even though he was ancient and I was running for my life. It felt like adventure. We reached the coastal city on the 7th night. Lucian was right. It was busy, chaotic, full of people from everywhere. Ships crowded the harbor, their sails like clouds in the moonlight. The streets smelled of salt and fish and spices from distant lands. We found a room in a boarding house on the edge of the city, the kind of place that asked no questions as long as you paid in advance. It was small and drafty, and the bed was lumpy, but it was ours. Lucian stood at the window, looking out at the city, and he told me this could work. We could blend in here, could lose ourselves in the crowds. He said he'd find work. There were always jobs for someone with his strength, his education. We could build something, even if it was temporary. I asked him if he thought we'd be happy here. He turned from the window and looked at me with an expression I'd seen before, that mixture of love and sadness that seemed to define us. He told me he was already happy, happier than he'd been in centuries, and for a while, we were. 3 months passed in that coastal city. Lucian found work as a clerk for a shipping company. His centuries of knowledge made him perfect for tracking manifests and managing accounts. I found work in a bakery, kneading dough and tending ovens, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold castle I'd left behind. We lived quietly, carefully. Lucien never fed in the city itself, always traveling out to the countryside when the hunger became too strong. He told me he tried to take from people who wouldn't miss it. Criminals, mostly, people who hurt others. He said it made it easier, morally, though the taste was still bitter with their cruelty. We had friends, sort of. The baker's daughter, Maria, who taught me the best techniques for braiding bread. The old sailor who lived downstairs and told impossible stories about sea monsters. The doctor who set my wrist properly and asked no questions about how it had been broken. We had routines. Morning walks along the pier before sunrise. Evenings spent reading in our small room. Sundays in the market, buying fresh food that I would eat, and Lucian would pretend to enjoy watching me eat. We had moments of perfect, ordinary happiness. But we both knew it couldn't last. The sign started small. A stranger in the market who watched us too intently. A ship that arrived with no cargo, and a crew that moved too smoothly, too carefully. Rumors of attacks on the outskirts of town. People drained dry in ways that suggested something other than human violence. Lucian noticed first, of course. He told me one night that we'd been found, or would be soon. The vampires were closing in. I asked him how long we had. He said maybe a week, maybe less. I wanted to run again, wanted to keep fleeing from city to city, buying ourselves more time. But Lucian shook his head. He explained that we'd gotten lucky once, had escaped through cleverness and desperation. But the vampires knew our tricks now, knew our patterns. If we ran again, they'd be ready. I asked him what alternative we had. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me about something he'd heard once, centuries ago. A legend among vampires, whispered about, but never confirmed. There was supposedly a place, far to the south, beyond the great desert, where humans and vampires lived in peace, where vampires had learned to survive without killing, had found other ways to feed, other ways to exist. He said most vampires dismissed it as myth, but he'd met a traveler once, back in his early centuries, who swore he'd been there, who described a city of white stone where predator and prey had learned to be something other than enemies. I asked him if he believed it existed. He told me honestly that he didn't know. It might be real, it might be fantasy, but it was the only hope we had left. So we made plans. The journey south would be treacherous, through territories held by hostile vampires, across a desert that killed unprepared travelers, into lands neither of us knew. It would take months, maybe a year, and there was no guarantee we'd find anything at the end. But the alternative was staying and dying. So really, there was no choice at all. We left the coastal city on a moonless night, slipping away like shadows. Maria found the note I'd left her, along with the recipes I'd written out and a small bag of coins. The sailor would find his rent paid 3 months in advance and a bottle of good whiskey. The doctor would find his fee for setting my wrist, tripled, with a thank you note. We couldn't say goodbye properly. That would have been too suspicious, too memorable. So we just left, taking only what we could carry. The journey south was harder than the journey to the coast had been. We were traveling against time now, staying ahead of hunters we knew were following. Lucian pushed us harder, resting less, taking more risks. I got sick after the first month. Some kind of fever from bad water or spoiled food. I tried to hide it, tried to keep moving, but eventually I collapsed in the middle of the road. I woke up in a cave, fever burning through me, Lucian's face above mine tight with worry. He told me I'd been unconscious for 2 days. He'd carried me, had found shelter, had tried everything he knew to break the fever, but nothing was working. I remember that conversation in pieces, fragmented by delirium. I remember asking him if I was dying. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I remember telling him not to blame himself, that I'd chosen this, that I'd choose it again. I remember him saying my name over and over, like a prayer, like if he said it enough times he could keep me tethered to life. And I remember the moment he made the decision, I saw it in his eyes, saw the exact instant when he chose. He asked me if I wanted to live, really live, even if it meant changing everything. I understood what he was asking. I told him I didn't want to be a vampire. I didn't want to lose my humanity, didn't want to become the thing we'd been running from. He told me I wouldn't have to. He explained there was another way, something he'd never tried but had heard was possible. If he gave me his blood while I was on the edge of death, not to turn me but to heal me, it might work, might save me without making me vampire. But it might not, he warned. It might turn me anyway, or it might kill me outright. He said he didn't know, had never known anyone who'd survived the attempt. I asked him what he thought I should do. He looked at me with such anguish. He told me he couldn't make that choice for me. He said he loved me too much to take away my humanity without my permission, but he also loved me too much to just let me die. I thought about it, as much as I could through the fever. I thought about Thomas and his coming child, about my mother's singing, about the warmth of sunlight on my skin, all the human things I'd lose if I became vampire. But I also thought about Lucian, about the way he looked at me like I was his reason for existing. about the life we were trying to build, the city we were trying to reach, about all the time we might have together if I just survived this. I told him to do it, to try. Whatever happened, happened. He cut his wrist with his own fangs and pressed it to my lips. His blood tasted like metal and ice and something ancient. I drank because he told me to, because I trusted him, because I didn't want to die in a cave in the middle of nowhere. The effect was immediate and agonizing. It felt like fire was replacing my blood, like my entire body was being rewritten at the cellular level. I screamed, or tried to. Lucian held me down, held his wrist to my mouth, forced me to keep drinking even as I convulsed. Then, just as suddenly, the pain stopped. I opened my eyes. The fever was gone. The weakness was gone. I felt different, stronger, sharper, but not wrong, not dead. Lucian pulled his wrist away and watched me with an intensity that was almost frightening. He asked me how I felt. I took inventory. My heart was still beating. I could feel it, strong and steady. I was breathing normally. My skin was warm, not cold. I was still human, but I wasn't the same. I could see better in the darkness of the cave, could hear water dripping somewhere far below that I shouldn't have been able to hear. I could smell everything, the stone, the dirt, Lucien's scent of old books and rain. He explained quietly that I wasn't vampire, but I wasn't entirely human anymore either. His blood had changed me, had made me something in between, stronger, faster, sharper than normal humans, but still mortal, still warm, still alive. I asked him how long I would live like this. He told me he didn't know. Maybe a normal human lifespan. Maybe longer. The legends about this were vague, contradictory. He said we'd figure it out together. I tested my new strength, my new senses. It was disorienting but not unpleasant. Like seeing the world in color after a lifetime of black and white. I told him thank you, for saving me, for not making me choose between dying and becoming something I didn't want to be. He pulled me close and held me, and I realized he was shaking. He told me he'd been terrified, that watching me die had been worse than anything he'd experienced in 7 centuries. He said he couldn't lose me. Not yet. Not when we still had so much time left to steal. We rested another day in that cave while I adjusted to the changes. Then we continued south. The journey was easier after that. My new strength meant I could keep pace with Lucienne better, could travel further without tiring. We made better time, covered more ground. We crossed the border into the desert 2 months later. It was vast and brutal and beautiful, sand stretching to every horizon, the sun a merciless eye above. We traveled at night, as always, but now the cold didn't bother me as much. Lucian said that was the vampire blood in me, making me more resilient. We almost didn't make it. There was a storm, a sandstorm that came out of nowhere and nearly buried us. We got separated in the chaos, the wind howling so loud I couldn't hear Lucian calling my name. I wandered for hours, blinded by sand, certain I was going to die alone in that desert. Then, just as dawn was breaking, I saw it. A city. White stone walls rising from the sand like a mirage. Towers with copper domes that caught the first light. Gardens visible over the walls, impossibly green against the desert brown. I stumbled toward it, not sure if it was real or a fever dream. But as I got closer, I saw people on the walls. Human people, watching me approach. They opened the gates. Not wide, just a crack, but enough. A woman came out, covered against the sun, and asked me in accented words who I was and what I wanted. I told her I was looking for sanctuary, for a place where I didn't have to hide. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked me if I was alone. I told her no, that I'd been traveling with someone but we'd gotten separated in the storm. I described Lucian, explained what he was, asked if she'd seen him. Her expression shifted then, became more guarded. She told me vampires weren't allowed in the city during daylight, but if my companion had survived the storm, he would be at the shelter, a cave system about a mile north where vampires could wait out the sun. She offered to take me there once the sun set, but she said I should come inside first. Get water, get food, get out of the heat. I almost refused. I wanted to find Lucian immediately, wanted to make sure he was okay. But I was exhausted, dehydrated, and the sun was climbing higher. There was no way I could reach the shelter and back before it got dangerously hot. So I accepted. I let her lead me through the gates, into the White City. It was everything the legend had promised and more. The streets were clean, lined with trees that provided shade. There were humans and vampires moving together, talking, working side by side. I saw a vampire tending a garden while a human child played nearby. I saw humans and vampires sharing a meal in a courtyard. The humans eating food, the vampires drinking what looked like wine but probably wasn't. The woman who'd found me, her name was Yasmin, explained as we walked. She told me the city was called Lumenis, and it had existed for over 300 years. It had been founded by a group of vampires and humans who'd grown tired of the old ways, tired of the cycle of predator and prey. They'd developed a system, she said. Vampires could feed from willing humans, just a little at a time, never enough to hurt or change them. In exchange, the vampires protected the city, used their strength and immortality to maintain defenses against hostile forces. Both species benefited. Both species survived. I asked her if it really worked, if there was really peace here. She admitted it wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still conflicts, but yes, it worked. She said it worked because everyone here had chosen it, had decided that coexistence was better than endless violence. She took me to a guest house and left me with food, water, and clothes that actually fit. She told me to rest, that she'd come back at sunset to take me to the shelter. I tried to sleep but couldn't. I kept thinking about Lucien, hoping he'd found shelter, that he was safe. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Finally, the sun began to set. Yasmin returned and led me through the city to the northern gate. We walked out into the cooling desert, toward a rocky outcrop in the distance. The shelter was a cave system, like she'd said, but it had been modified, improved. There were doors, lamps, even furniture. Yasmin explained that vampires often had to wait here during the day if they were traveling, so the city had made it comfortable. There were 3 vampires inside when we entered. 2 I didn't recognize, but the third, sitting in the shadows at the back of the cave, was Lucian. He saw me and stood so quickly he knocked over the chair he'd been sitting in. We crossed the space between us in seconds, and then he was holding me, his hands in my hair, his face pressed against my neck. He told me he'd thought I was dead. He said he'd searched through the storm until the sun forced him to take shelter, and then he'd been trapped, unable to do anything but imagine every horrible fate that might have befallen me. I told him I was okay. I'd found the city. I'd found him. We were okay. He pulled back and looked at me, really looked at me. Then he looked past me at Yasmin, who was standing politely in the cave entrance. She told him welcome to Lumenis. She said if we wanted sanctuary, we'd need to speak with the council tomorrow night. But for now, we were safe. The council meeting was intimidating. 5 vampires and 5 humans, sitting in a semicircle, asking us questions. Where we'd come from, why we'd come here, what we were running from. Lucian answered honestly. He told them about Castle Noctis, about the old ways, about how he'd broken their laws for love. He explained that we were being hunted, that we'd probably brought danger to their doorstep by coming here. The council exchanged looks. Then one of the vampire counselors, an ancient woman with kind eyes, told us they'd suspected as much. She said they'd seen the signs of hunters in the desert, vampires searching for something. But she said that was nothing new. Lumenis was always under threat from vampires who rejected their way of life. They'd survived for 3 centuries by being strong, united, and committed to their principles. She asked us if we were committed to those principles, if we could live in peace with both species, if we could contribute to their society. We said yes. We'd already been living that way for months, I pointed out. This city was just a more permanent version of what we'd been building on our own. The council deliberated for what felt like hours. Finally, they reached a decision. We could stay, on a trial basis, for 1 year. We'd be given housing, work opportunities, but we'd be watched to make sure we weren't bringing the old violence with us. And if the hunters from Castle Noctis came, we'd be expected to help defend the city. We agreed to everything. They gave us a small house on the eastern edge of the city, with white walls and a garden that needed tending. Lucian found work as a historian, recording the city's stories and teaching young vampires about the old world. I worked in the communal kitchens, baking bread that reminded me of my mother's. It wasn't perfect. There were hard days, lonely days, days when we heard rumors of hunters getting closer and wondered if we should run again. But there were good days, too. Days when we walked through the city hand in hand and no one stared or whispered. Days when we sat in our garden and watched the sunset, marveling that we'd survived long enough to see it. Days when we were simply happy. 6 months into our trial, the hunters finally came. There were 5 of them, ancient vampires from Castle Noctis, sent to retrieve Lucian and execute me. They arrived at night, demanding entry to the city, demanding we be turned over immediately. The council refused. What followed was a battle unlike anything I'd ever seen. The vampires of Lumenis fought alongside their human partners, using tactics and strategies developed over centuries of cooperation. They used sunlight strategically, mirrors and reflective surfaces to channel it into weapons. They used silver and holy water and the terrain itself as advantages. Lucian fought like I'd never seen him fight before. Not with the wild rage he'd shown protecting me at the castle, but with focused determination. He was fighting for something now, not just for me, but for the city, for the life we'd built, for the principle that a better way was possible. The battle lasted until dawn. When the sun rose, 3 of the 5 hunters had been destroyed. The other 2 retreated into the desert, badly wounded. We'd won, but the cost had been high. 7 vampires from Lumenis had been destroyed. 12 humans had died. The northern wall had been partially destroyed. In the aftermath, as we helped clear rubble and tend the wounded, something shifted. The council approached us and told us our trial period was over. They said we'd proven ourselves, proven we were part of this city now. We'd found home. That was 5 years ago. I'm standing in our garden now, watching the sun rise over the white walls of Lumenis. I'm 28 years old, though I still look like I did at 23. Apparently, Lucian's blood slowed my aging as well as strengthening me. He says I might live for a century or more like this, and I don't know how I feel about that. But I'm trying to accept it as the gift it is. More time with him, more time in this place we've built. Lucian is inside, sleeping through the day as he must. Tonight we'll work in the garden together. Maybe walk the city walls. Maybe visit with friends. Tomorrow is the festival of founding, when the whole city celebrates another year of survival, another year of peace. I still think about my brother sometimes. Thomas would be 24 now. His child would be 4. I wonder if they're happy, if they think of me, if they even remember me. I think about the castle, about the servants still trapped there, living invisible lives. I hope someday they find their own way out, their own path to something better. I think about what Yasmin told me that first day, that this city was built by people who decided coexistence was better than endless violence. That seems obvious now, but I know how radical it was, how radical it still is. Most of the world still lives by the old rules: predator and prey, human and vampire locked in eternal conflict. But not here. Here, we chose differently. Every morning, when the sun touches my skin, I feel it. That warmth Lucian noticed in my blood all those years ago. That hope, it's still there, maybe stronger now. Because I've seen what happens when hope is chosen over fear, when love is chosen over power. It doesn't always end well. I know that. We lost people in that battle. We'll lose more in battles to come. The old vampires, the ones who can't imagine a different way, won't stop trying to destroy this place, but we'll keep defending it. Because this city, this impossible dream of humans and vampires living together, of predator and prey becoming partners, it's proof that change is possible, that even ancient, cursed things can learn to be different. Lucian appears in the doorway, pulled from his rest by some vampire sense that I'm awake. He crosses the garden to stand beside me, and we watch the sunrise together, him from the safety of the shadows, me with the light full on my face. He asks me what I'm thinking about. I tell him I'm thinking about how we got here, about every choice and chance that led us from that castle to this garden, about how many times we could have died, should have died, but didn't. He's quiet for a moment, Then he tells me he's been thinking about something I said once, years ago, about mortality giving life meaning. He says he understands now, truly, because even though he's immortal, even though he might exist for centuries more, our time together is finite. Someday I'll die, maybe in 50 years, maybe in 100, but eventually. And knowing that, knowing our time is limited, even if his isn't, makes every moment precious. He tells me that's what I gave him. Not immortality, not escape from his curse, just the ability to value time again, to feel urgency again, to love something enough that its inevitable loss would matter. I take his cold hand in my warm one, and I tell him we should make the most of it then. However much time we have, he agrees, and then we stand there together, human and vampire, mortal and immortal, watching the sun rise over the city we helped save. And I think about that night in the castle, when I was just an invisible servant scrubbing floors, when Lucian first stopped to look at me. When he told me my blood sang of sunlight and summer and hope. He was right. I did carry light inside me. But what I didn't know then, what I understand now, is that light grows when it's shared. When I gave him hope, he gave me courage. When he gave me strength, I gave him purpose. We made each other better, made each other more than we could have been alone. And that's what this city is, that principle written large. Vampires and humans making each other better, making each other more. Not predator and prey, but partners. Not enemies, but family. It won't spread overnight. It might not spread at all. The old world, the world of Castle Noctis and ancient cruelties, is vast and powerful. We're just one city, one small light against an ocean of darkness. But we're here. We exist. We prove it's possible. And every morning, when the sun touches my face and I feel that warmth run through me, I remember. I remember the cold castle and the endless nights and the blood on marble floors. I remember running and hiding and fearing for our lives, and I'm grateful. Grateful for the journey. Grateful for the pain that made the joy more precious. Grateful for the curse that taught me what blessing really meant, because I spent years cleaning blood from stone, invisible and forgotten. But someone noticed. Someone saw the light in me and chose it over the darkness he'd known for centuries. And now, every morning, I stand in the sun. I breathe in the warm air of this impossible city. I tend my garden and bake my bread and love the vampire who saved me by letting me save him. The world is still full of monsters and cruelty and endless night, but here, in this place, at this moment, there is also light. And that light, the one that Lucian noticed in my blood all those years ago, the one I thought would die in that castle, is still burning. It always will be. Because that's what hope does. That's what love does. It survives.